What if a small band of warriors crossing the Strait of Gibraltar changed the fate of a continent forever? What if the fall of a kingdom to the Moors was not a defeat, but the unexpected birth of a global empire? Imagine a land where three faiths collided, where centuries of struggle forged an identity stronger than any sword. This is not just history. It is a story of fateful choices, fierce battles, and irreversible consequences. The stage is medieval Spain, a crucible of civilizations that shaped the modern world in ways still echoing today. But how did this extraordinary transformation begin? Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, like it, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you. The year was 711. The Visigothic kingdom, ruling over Hispania since the fall of Rome, stood fragile and divided. Its capital, Toledo, was a federation of tribes under a king elected by the nobility, an unstable balance of power that bred constant conflict. The Visigoths clung to Arian Christianity, a faith branded heretical by the Catholic Church, deepening divisions within the realm. When the Moors invaded, they found a fractured land ripe for conquest. But this was only the beginning of a far more complex saga. What if the Visigoths, despite their power, could not unite their people? Most inhabitants were descendants of Romanized Iberians and colonists, who saw the Visigoths as barbarian overlords. Cities that once thrived under Roman rule decayed, trade diminished, and education retreated into monasteries. Power rested not with the king, but with local magnates, lords whose ambitions fractured any hope of unity. Yet, even in this chaos, Hispania remained connected to the wider world through the Mediterranean's bustling trade routes and links across the strait to North Africa. Now, picture the streets of this ancient Iberia. Imagine hearing the call of the muezzin, the ringing of Christian bells, and prayers whispered in synagogues all within earshot. A world where scholars from different faiths collaborated, translating lost treasures of classical knowledge from Arabic into Latin, igniting the renaissance of a continent. What was born in these moments of coexistence would fuel the rise of modern Europe. Yet, beneath the surface, the pressure of religious fervor and political rivalry simmered dangerously. Fast forward through centuries of relentless struggle known as the Reconquista, the reconquest of lands wrested away by the Moors. This grueling fight forged the Spanish character, a blend of unyielding faith, fierce militarism, and an insatiable hunger for imperial glory. From these fires emerged the Spanish idea, a phenomenon that united zealotry and ambition into a force that would build the first true global empire, an empire upon which the sun, famously, never set. But the question lingers, what if that initial Moorish invasion had been repelled? Would Spain have ever risen to such heights? Spain, known today for flamenco and bullfights, for paella and sangria, for Don Quixote and the Inquisition, bears a cultural heritage born from this extraordinary fusion of East and West. It was here that the Age of Discovery ignited, sending explorers beyond the known world, reshaping the global map forever. The seeds of empire were sown in those perilous centuries of faith and war, proving that even the darkest defeats can be the prelude to unprecedented triumph. But what of the Visigothic legacy, the kingdom that preceded this empire? Their acceptance of Catholicism in the late 6th century was meant to unify Spain, yet political strife endured. The Visigothic system, based on elective monarchy and tribal alliances, never forged a true nation-state. Instead, it created a fragile mosaic of power struggles that left the peninsula vulnerable to invasion. This failure set the stage for one of history's most dramatic reversals, a downfall that paradoxically became a foundation for greatness. Imagine the arduous lives of the common people during this era. Peasants bound to the land under the yoke of powerful landlords, cities crumbling, knowledge preserved only in the silence of monasteries. The once great Roman influence faded, yet the pulse of the Mediterranean still beat strong, carrying Spanish gold, silver, olive oil, wine, and wool to distant markets. Across the narrow strait, in what had been Roman Africa, forces stirred that would soon converge with Iberia's fate in ways no one could predict. What drives a people to cross seas and rewrite the fate of continents? How does a single choice ignite a chain reaction that changes history forever? In the middle of the 7th century, a new force surged forth. Arab armies united by a profound faith: Islam. Within mere decades, they conquered vast lands, stretching from Persia all the way to Egypt. By the end of that tumultuous century, their reach extended to the Maghreb, the northwest of Africa. But these invaders did not come with just swords. They carried a new religion, a new culture, and a radical worldview. Islam, with its strict monotheism, clear laws, and promises of justice, captivated many hearts. The indigenous Berbers of North Africa, long resistant to Roman and Byzantine rule, began to embrace this new faith. Yet, even as they accepted Islam, they fiercely preserved their own cultural identity. By the turn of the 7th to the 8th century, the Islamic world stood at the edge of the Atlantic, separated from Christian Spain by a narrow strait. The stage was set for collision. Meanwhile, in the Visigothic kingdom, a deadly power struggle was unfolding. When King Witiza died in the year 710, his sons expected to inherit the throne. But the Visigothic nobility chose a different man, Roderick. Discontent brewed fiercely among Witiza's heirs and their supporters, plunging the kingdom into civil war. It was in this moment of fracturing that some Visigothic nobles looked southward, seeking allies among the Muslim rulers of North Africa. One such noble was Count Julian, ruler of Ceuta, a city on the African coast, and a loyalist to Witiza's sons. According to some accounts, Julian turned to Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of North Africa, pleading for help against Roderick. This request was a pivotal miscalculation, an invitation that would shatter centuries of European history. In the spring of 711, Musa sent a reconnaissance force under the Berber leader Tariq ibn Malik across the strait to southern Spain. The raid returned with abundant loot and prisoners, encountering little resistance. The success ignited Musa's ambition. In April 712, a larger army, led by another Berber commander, Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the waters and landed at a rocky promontory that would forever bear his name, Jabal Tariq, or Gibraltar. Tariq's force was modest, estimated between 7,000 and 12,000 warriors, mostly Berbers, but they were fiercely motivated by faith and the promise of plunder. According to legend, upon landing, Tariq ordered the burning of their ships, proclaiming, "The sea is behind you, the enemy ahead. By Allah, you have no choice but to fight and win." This moment sealed their fate, binding them to a path of no return. King Roderick, confronted with this sudden invasion, mustered his army and marched south. In July 712, the two forces clashed near the Guadalete River. The details of the battle remain shrouded in mystery, but the outcome was devastating. The Visigothic army was crushed, and Roderick was killed, either in combat or while fleeing. Some sources claim that factions loyal to Witiza's sons defected to the Muslim side mid-battle, sealing the Visigothic downfall. The victory at Guadalete shattered the kingdom's defenses. Without a king, and with their morale broken, the Visigothic realm stood vulnerable. Tariq pushed forward swiftly, aiming for Toledo, the capital. The city fell with little resistance, its people overwhelmed by the speed of conquest and the chaos of civil war. The conquest did not distribute power evenly. The Arab forces claimed the richest lands in the south and east, while the Berbers, despite their crucial role, were left with poorer territories in the center and north. This imbalance sowed seeds of discontent and periodic rebellions among the Berbers. As these new rulers established their domain, the fate of the native populations hung in the balance, caught between conquerors, cultures, and the relentless march of history. Every decision, every alliance, every betrayal carved a path that could not be undone. The choice of the Visigothic nobles to involve foreign powers, the burning of ships in a land far from home, each was a thread in a tapestry of irreversible change. And so, the shores of Spain witnessed not only the fall of a kingdom, but the birth of a new era, forged in fire, faith, and fate. What happens when power shifts in the shadows? When a dynasty falls, and a lone prince escapes with nothing but his will to survive? In the year 750, a brutal coup in Damascus shattered the Umayyad dynasty, leaving almost all of its members dead. But one young prince, Abd ar-Rahman, defied fate. He fled, hunted and desperate, crossing deserts and seas to find refuge. What did this exile mean for the future of Al-Andalus? The stage was set for an irreversible upheaval. Arriving in Al-Andalus, Abd-ar-Rahman seized power with the backing of loyal Umayyad Arabs, proclaiming himself emir in 756. Though still nominally acknowledging the Abbasid caliph's religious authority, he forged a new reality, Al-Andalus as a practically independent state. This moment marked the birth of a political entity that would blend Arab, Berber, and local customs into a resilient system of governance. But with independence came immense challenges. Could this fledgling emirate survive the turbulent tides to come? Beneath the surface, the population was a complex mosaic. Christians and Jews, people of the Scripture, were granted the status of dhimmi, protected minorities allowed to retain their religion and customs, but only if they paid the special jizya tax. Christians living under Muslim rule became known as muwallads, Arabized, yet not fully embraced. Many converted to Islam, becoming muladis, motivated partly by genuine faith, but also by stark pragmatism. Muslims paid fewer taxes and enjoyed greater social mobility. The choices were heavy, the consequences often irreversible. By the mid-8th century, the Muslim population in Al-Andalus had grown substantially, not only from new settlers from North Africa and the broader Islamic world, but also from local conversions. Yet Muslims remained a minority, roughly 20% of the population. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, lines blurred, loyalties tested. How long could this fragile balance hold before it snapped? Under Umayyad rule, Cordoba blossomed into one of Europe's grandest cities. By the 10th century, its population reached 400,000, surpassing any Christian city of the era. Over 700 mosques dotted the cityscape, surrounded by palaces, public baths, and libraries. Streets were paved and illuminated, a stark contrast to the filthy, dark Christian cities of medieval Europe. This was a civilization at its zenith, but with high stature came even higher stakes. Then came Abd-ar-Rahman III, whose reign from 912 to 961 marked the peak of Umayyad power. In 929 he declared himself caliph, severing even symbolic ties to the Abbasids. The Caliphate of Cordoba emerged as a formidable political and cultural force, a beacon of intellect and governance. Yet with such power came the question, would this glory endure or crumble under the weight of its own ambition? Cordoba's transformation was astonishing. The caliph's library housed over 400,000 volumes, dwarfing Christian Europe's largest monasteries, which held only hundreds. The university drew scholars and students from across Islamic lands and Christian Europe alike. Sciences, philosophy, poetry, music flourished like nowhere else. But this vibrant intellectual life was not immune to the currents of conflict and fear swirling beyond the city walls. Al-Andalus was a society built on complexity and contradiction. It was an urban civilization, with bustling cities serving as centers of craftsmanship and trade. Ingenious irrigation systems crafted by Muslim engineers transformed arid lands into fertile fields. Crops previously unknown in Europe, rice, sugarcane, eggplants, saffron, and exotic fruits were introduced, altering diets and economies forever. Yet beneath this prosperity lay fragile alliances between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. How long could this precarious coexistence withstand external pressures and internal rivalries? Religious tolerance here was relative, a delicate balance rather than an absolute. Christians and Jews, though subject to limitations, were permitted to practice their faith openly, and even hold high administrative positions. Jews played a particularly crucial role, serving as multilingual intermediaries between diverse cultures. Still, this openness masked deep currents of fear and uncertainty. How many faced crossroads where their next choice meant survival or annihilation? Every decision carved a path toward a future none could see clearly. The rise of Abd-ar-Rahman I and his descendants was no mere historical footnote. It was a saga of survival, power, faith, and the human will to shape destiny amid chaos. Al-Andalus's story is a testament to the irreversible consequences of choices made in shadows, where trust is fragile and fear ever present. The question remains, will history remember this era as a golden age or a tragic prelude to collapse? What happens when a civilization reaches the peak of human achievement, yet faces the shadows of inevitable collapse? How did the golden age of Al-Andalus, ruled by figures like Abd-ar-Rahman I and Abd-ar-Rahman III, balance brilliance with looming fractures? Beneath the splendor, what choices set the stage for irreversible consequences? The story of Al-Andalus is woven with fateful decisions and the gripping human fear of what lies ahead. At the heart of Al-Andalus, a cultural explosion unfolded, an extraordinary fusion of Roman, Byzantine, Persian, and local architectural marvels. The great mosque of Córdoba rose from the vision of Abd-ar-Rahman I and his successors, its prayer hall a forest of marble, granite, and jasper columns crowned with double-tiered arches. This infinite space did not just embody religious devotion. It was a bold statement of power and permanence. Yet, beneath its endless arches, the question lingered: how long could such grandeur endure? A few miles away, the palace complex of Medina Azahra was born from the ambitions of Abd-ar-Rahman III, named after his beloved concubine, Azahra. Gardens bursting with exotic plants and fountains surrounded this engineering marvel, a testament to an empire at the height of its prowess. But the palace, like a fragile dream, was doomed to crumble, destroyed in the brutal civil wars of the early 11th century. The ruins whisper a chilling truth: even the mightiest creations can be swept away in the tides of conflict. The poets of Al-Andalus sang of nature's beauty, life's fleeting joys, and the torment of love. They innovated with forms like muwasha and zajal, mixing classical Arabic with colloquial speech and Romance languages, redefining poetry itself. This bold linguistic blend rippled across Europe, forever altering its poetic traditions. Yet, behind this creative surge lay a deeper tension. Cultural fusion was a double-edged sword, bridging worlds while sowing seeds of identity struggles. Music was the lifeblood of courtly life in Córdoba and beyond, where lutes, rebobs, early violins, and flutes filled the air with intricate, haunting melodies. Terms like lute, guitar, and rebec passed from Arabic through Moorish Spain into European languages, a testament to an enduring legacy. But as melodies floated through grand halls, the empire's foundations trembled. Would this cultural brilliance shield them from the storms gathering far beyond the palace walls? Science flourished relentlessly in Al-Andalus. Visionaries like Al-Idrisi charted one of the earliest accurate world maps, while physicians Ibn Zur, known in Europe as Avenzoar, and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, revolutionized medicine. Their treatises, translated into Latin, spread through Europe, sparking scientific revolutions. Yet these intellectual triumphs masked a fragile peace. Each breakthrough stood on the edge of a precipice where politics and war could unravel progress in an instant. Philosophers such as Ibn Bajjah, Avempace, Ibn Tufayl, and especially Ibn Rushd, wrestled with Aristotle's legacy, blending it with Islamic theology. Their works, later embraced and challenged by luminaries like Thomas Aquinas, shaped scholasticism and Western thought. But this marriage of reason and faith was a volatile dance. One misstep could ignite fierce ideological battles, threatening to tear apart the delicate fabric of knowledge. Behind the scenes, translators toiled in Toledo and other Andalusian centers, preserving Greek masterpieces lost to Western Europe after Rome's fall. Without their painstaking work, the wisdom of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen might have vanished forever. Yet this cultural preservation was a gamble, a Tower of Babel built on borrowed words, subject to collapse amid rising tensions between faiths and factions. Daily life in Al-Andalus diverged sharply from Christian Europe, with an emphasis on hygiene and public baths, symbolizing an advanced society. However, this flourishing society was not immune to turmoil. The rise of mighty commanders like the formidable military leader who launched over 50 campaigns against northern Christian states and even sacked Santiago de Compostela signaled a relentless power struggle. As victories piled up, so did fractures within the Umayyad dynasty, threatening to unravel all they had built. The golden age of Al-Andalus shone brilliantly, but in the shadows, the forces of civil war and political intrigue gathered like a storm. The destruction of Medina Azara and the ensuing conflicts of the early 11th century were not mere accidents. They were the consequences of choices made by those who wielded power. Could the dazzling achievements of art, science, and culture withstand the brutal realities of human ambition and fear? The answer lay in the ruins and in the hearts of those who lived through the fall. What happens when a mighty empire crumbles from within? How do the echoes of one ruler's death ignite a firestorm of chaos? After the death of al-Mansur in the year 1002, followed by his son Abd al-Malik in 1008, Al-Andalus plunged into a vortex of civil war. Claimants to the caliphate title tore the land apart, each desperate to seize power. The once unified Cordoban Caliphate shattered, officially dissolving in the year 1031. But what price would this fragmentation demand? From the ashes of collapse rose the era of the Taifas, tiny, fractious kingdoms born from political disarray. Yet, paradoxically, this period sparked a cultural renaissance. Courts in Seville, Granada, Zaragoza, and Toledo became beacons of refined art and science. Poets and scholars drifted from patron to patron, weaving a tapestry of ideas across the fractured land. But beneath this blossoming culture lurked a deadly weakness. Political fragmentation left Muslim Spain vulnerable to a relentless northern tide. What storm was gathering beyond the horizon? For centuries, Christian kingdoms had held the northern mountains, resisting Moorish expansion. In the rugged Asturian and Cantabrian ranges, a small Christian kingdom endured. Legend tells of Pelayo, a Visigoth nobleman, who in the year 722 struck a blow against the invaders at the Battle of Covadonga. Though likely a minor skirmish, this clash became a symbol of resistance, the spark that ignited the Reconquista. The cave of Our Lady of Covadonga, where Pelayo and his warriors prayed before battle, transformed into a sacred pilgrimage site. But could this fragile kingdom withstand the tides of war? Initially, the kingdom of Asturias was a tiny, impoverished realm, hemmed in by mountains and sea. Yet its rulers were relentless, expanding southward and westward. By the mid-9th century, King Ordoño I founded fortified settlements known as the Presuras, stretching into what is now León and northern Portugal. Meanwhile, in the northeast, another Christian power was taking shape, the Kingdom of Navarre, nestled in the Pyrenean valleys. How would these fledgling states shape the fate of the peninsula? Navarre's rulers walked a razor's edge, balancing between Frankish and Moorish forces. But under King Sancho the Great, who reigned from 1004 to 1035, Navarre reached its zenith, briefly uniting much of Christian Spain under one crown. Yet this fragile unity shattered upon Sancho's death, his lands divided among his sons. Garcia inherited Navarre, Fernando took Castile, once a county under Leon but now independent, and Ramiro, an illegitimate son, claimed Aragon. These divisions forged the main Christian kingdoms destined to drive the Reconquista forward. But would their rivalry doom or fuel their cause? The political map of Christian Spain was in constant flux. In the year 1037, Fernando I of Castile conquered Leon, merging two kingdoms into a formidable power. Decades later, in 1094, Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Barcelona, married Petronilla, heiress of Aragon, setting the stage for the union of Aragon and Catalonia. Meanwhile, in the west, the Kingdom of Portugal emerged in 1143, breaking away from Leon and Castile. Each new alliance and conquest redrew the lines of power, but also deepened the stakes. What battles lay ahead? The 11th century marked a turning point in the Reconquista. The fall of the Cordoban Caliphate and the fragmentation of the Taifas created a rare opening for Christian forces. In 1085, Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon seized Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital. This victory was both symbolic and strategic, a beacon of hope and a rallying cry. But the Muslim rulers, desperate to stem the tide, turned to the Almoravids, a Berber dynasty ruling North Africa. What storm would this new alliance unleash upon the peninsula? The decisions made in these years were irreversible, the consequences profound. Each choice, each battle, each alliance carved a path that could not be undone. Fear gripped leaders on both sides, knowing that a single misstep could mean annihilation or triumph. The fate of a continent hung in the balance, as old empires crumbled and new powers rose from the shadows. What price would be paid for survival, and who would be left standing when the dust settled? What happens when fanaticism shatters an age of tolerance? In 1086, fervent warriors crossing the strait unleashed devastation upon Alfonso VI's forces at the Battle of Sagrajas. This pivotal clash didn't just alter the battlefield, it reshaped the fate of Al-Andalus itself, uniting the Taifas under the banner of the Almoravids. But the world they forged was far from peaceful. The era of peaceful coexistence was brutally erased. Almoravid rule imposed a harsh orthodoxy that did not spare Christians, Jews, or even Muslims who diverged from their strict creed. Their reign extended until the mid-12th century, only to be supplanted by the Almohads, a Berber dynasty even more unyielding in religious zeal. Under their iron hand, countless Christians and Jews were forced from Al-Andalus, pushed to the edge of extinction. Yet the unstoppable tide of the Reconquista surged forward. Amidst this turbulent storm, military religious orders rose like dark sentinels. The orders of Calatrava, Santiago, and Alcántara, forged in the image of the Templars and Hospitallers. These knights were no mere soldiers. They were colonizers, fortress builders, protectors of settlers and pilgrims on the razor's edge of war. Powerful kings granted them vast lands along the Muslim-Christian border, fueling relentless campaigns that would decide who truly ruled the peninsula. But how did these newly conquered lands transform under such ruthless hands? Kings engineered the settlement of these borderlands with an iron will, drawing settlers from northern regions with promises sealed in fuero charters, legal shields granting privileges and freedoms unheard of elsewhere in feudal Europe. Cities grew, granted municipal rights and self-rule, nurturing a free peasantry defiant against traditional serfdom. Yet, beneath this emerging order, another community lingered, the Mudejars, Muslims who remained after conquest. Their fate teetered between tolerance and persecution. If a city surrendered peacefully, the Mudejars were often spared, allowed to keep their faith and possessions. But when walls were broken by storm and sword, mercy vanished. Families were enslaved or forced into exile. With each Christian advance, their world darkened. The line between survival and annihilation blurred, and the once diverse fabric of Al-Andalus began to tear. What forces could possibly bridge such divisions? The Reconquista was not only a series of battles, it was a cultural crucible. Christians absorbed elements of Moorish life, the intricate artistry of architecture, haunting melodies of music, exotic flavors of cuisine, and the rich tapestry of language. From this fusion emerged the Mudejar style, a haunting blend of Islamic and Christian influence that reshaped cities like Toledo and Seville. Here, Muslim architects and artisans built palaces and churches for their conquerors, weaving a silent, uneasy dialogue between worlds. Yet even beneath this exchange, ancient tensions simmered. In the city of Toledo, after its fall to Christian hands, a remarkable school of translators arose. Christians, Muslims, and Jews worked side by side, unlocking Arabic, scientific, and philosophical texts, translating them into Latin and Castilian. Through their efforts, Europe was reintroduced to the lost wisdom of antiquity, a knowledge that would ignite the Renaissance. But this fragile collaboration stood on a knife's edge, threatened by the ever-present specter of war and intolerance. Could this enlightenment survive the tides of conflict? The Reconquista was far from a steady march. It ebbed and flowed with fierce offensives and uneasy truces. Christians and Muslims often lived side by side in fragile peace, trading goods, ideas, and culture. Borders were porous and allegiances fluid. Some knights even switched sides to serve Muslim rulers when rejected by their own. In this volatile dance of power and faith, every decision carried irreversible consequences. But as the 15th century dawned, one question loomed larger than ever. Would the Christian kings finally extinguish the Muslim presence on the Iberian Peninsula? In 1481, they launched a merciless campaign against the Granada Emirate. City after city fell to relentless Christian forces. Despite desperate resistance, the balance of power was irrevocably shifting. Muhammad XII, known as Boabdil, the last emir of Granada, faced a grim choice: fight to the bitter end, or surrender all hope. The fate of a civilization hung in the balance. On the 2nd of January, 1492, Granada capitulated. The terms of surrender, surprisingly lenient, promised freedom for Muslims to practice their faith and preserve their property. Yet beneath this fragile peace lurked the shadow of inevitable change. Centuries of coexistence, conflict, and culture collided in that final act. The Reconquista had reached its devastating climax, but the echoes of its irreversible choices would resonate for generations to come. What drives a man to tears when his kingdom falls? Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler of Granada, looked back one final time at the city he could no longer protect. From the pass now called the Moors' Sigh, he wept. His mother's harsh words cut through the sorrow. "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." This was the end of an 800-year Muslim presence in Spain, the fall of Granada marking the final chapter of the Reconquista. But was this truly the end, or the ominous beginning of a new, tumultuous era? The year 1492, a year that would forever alter the course of history. The same year Granada fell, Christopher Columbus set sail westward, backed by Queen Isabella of Castile. His voyage would uncover the New World, igniting an age of unparalleled exploration and conquest. Spain was no longer just a kingdom recovering from centuries of conflict. It was on the verge of becoming the first global empire. Yet behind these grand ambitions lay a web of internal struggles and impossible choices. Isabella and Ferdinand faced a fractured realm, torn by decades of feudal strife and weakened royal authority. To forge their empire, they had to dismantle the power of the nobility, centralize governance, and create a standing army loyal only to the crown. Every reform sparked resistance. Every decision risked plunging the country back into chaos. But the monarchs pressed on, determined to shape Spain into a formidable power, no matter the human cost. To cement their control, the Catholic monarchs turned to the Church, the ultimate instrument of both faith and fear. With papal approval, Isabella and Ferdinand gained the right to appoint bishops and high-ranking clergy, weaving the Church tightly into the fabric of the state. This patronage became a double-edged sword, a tool for unity and a weapon for repression. The question loomed: how far would they go to achieve religious and political uniformity? In 1478, the Spanish Inquisition was born, a tribunal sworn to root out heresy within the kingdom. Initially targeting conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, the Inquisition's reach soon expanded. Muslims who converted, known as Moriscos, and various dissenting Christian sects found themselves under its shadow. The Inquisition was a dark emblem of Spain's new order, a system that thrived on fear and suspicion. But was its terror as boundless as legend suggests? Contrary to popular myth, the Spanish Inquisition was not unique. Similar tribunals existed across Catholic Europe, and by the legal standards of the time, its procedures were often less brutal than secular courts. The death toll, tragic though it was, numbered in the thousands over centuries, not millions as commonly believed. Still, the pervasive atmosphere of dread led many intellectuals and skilled professionals to flee Spain, bleeding the kingdom of vital talent and knowledge. Was this a price the monarchy was willing to pay? Then came the most heart-wrenching decree of all. On March 31st, 1492, the Alhambra Decree mandated that all Jews must either convert to Christianity or leave Spain within 4 months. Tens of thousands, estimates range from 50 to 200,000, chose exile, scattering across North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy. This mass expulsion shook the economic foundations of Spain, stripping cities, especially in Aragon, of their most prosperous and skilled citizens. Yet for Isabella and Ferdinand, religious unity outweighed economic devastation. How could they justify such ruthless sacrifice? The Moriscos, too, faced a grim future, their exile delayed but inevitable. The quest for a homogenized Spain demanded irreversible choices steeped in fear and ambition, casting long shadows over the nation's soul. Each decision, whether to weep over Granada, to launch ships across unknown seas, to wield faith as a weapon, echoed through generations. What price would Spain pay for empire? And at what cost to humanity? What happens when promises are broken and faith becomes a weapon? In 1499, despite the terms of Granada's surrender guaranteeing Muslims freedom of religion, the Crown of Castile demanded a brutal choice: convert or leave. By 1502, this decree extended to Muslims in Aragon. The stakes were clear: survival or exile. But what price would they pay for their secret faith? Most chose the path of outward conversion, becoming Moriscos, Muslims in name only, cloaked in Christian identity. Yet, beneath the surface, many clung to Islam in secret, their hidden devotion breeding suspicion and fear within the authorities. This fragile facade would soon shatter, igniting a relentless purge that would reshape Spain forever. Between 1609 and 1610, under King Philip III, nearly all Moriscos, some 300,000 souls, were expelled from Spain. This was not merely a religious crusade. It was a calculated move to forge a unified nation, to erase dissent and enforce conformity. But at what cost did this forced homogeneity come? Isabella and Ferdinand cast themselves as defenders of Catholicism, wielding faith as both shield and sword. Their religious zeal secured the Vatican's backing in European affairs and justified their aggressive expansion into North Africa and the New World. Yet beneath this grand design lay the fragile human fear of difference, the terror of the other that fuels irreversible choices. The creation of a unified Spanish state was no simple feat. Castile and Aragon were worlds apart politically and culturally. Castile boasted a centralized monarchy with strong royal authority, while Aragon was a confederation of 3 distinct territories: Aragon itself, Catalonia, and Valencia, each with its own laws, institutions, and even languages. How could these disparate lands be welded into one? The Catholic monarchs respected regional traditions, refraining from imposing a single legal or administrative system. Yet power quietly gravitated toward Castile. The Castilian model of governance began to seep into every corner of the crown's dominions, setting the stage for a slow but inexorable centralization. Language became a powerful tool in this transformation. In 1492, Antonio de Nebrija published the first grammar of the Castilian language, dedicating it to Queen Isabella herself. He proclaimed that language was the companion of empire. Castilian, later known as Spanish, spread beyond the Iberian Peninsula, becoming a global tongue across overseas territories. Meanwhile, the Catholic monarch's foreign policy was a chess game of dynastic marriages, securing alliances that would shape Europe's future. Their daughters married into the royal houses of Portugal, England, and the Habsburg lands. Their son, Prince Juan, wed Margaret of Austria, daughter of Emperor Maximilian I. But fate intervened. Juan died young, childless, unraveling their carefully woven plans. The crown passed to Joanna, known as the Mad for her mental illness. Married to Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian, she became the heir to Castile. Their son, Charles, inherited an empire that spanned Spain, the Netherlands, Italian territories, Central Europe, and the burgeoning colonies in America. In 1519, Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V, marking the dawn of the Habsburg era in Spain. Born and raised in the Netherlands, fluent in French and Dutch, Charles was a true European monarch. Yet his heart beat for Spain, the deeply Catholic land that became the bulwark of the Counter-Reformation, the fierce movement to renew the Catholic Church and crush Protestantism. The struggle for Italy, ignited under the Catholic monarchs, escalated into a brutal rivalry with France. The Valois kings, led by Francis I, claimed Naples, Milan, and other Italian territories. Charles V waged multiple wars against Francis, battles that would decide the fate of Europe's balance of power. Victory was not just a matter of territory. It was a battle for the soul of a continent. What happens when an empire stretched across continents faces relentless enemies on every front? How do the choices of one man ripple through decades of war and upheaval? In 1525, the French army was shattered at the Battle of Pavia, and King Francis I was taken prisoner. Yet, despite this crushing defeat, peace remained elusive. The conflict between the Habsburgs and the Valois, later the Bourbons, dragged on for over a century, each battle deepening the wounds of Europe. The stage was set for a struggle that would define an era, one of unyielding ambition and devastating consequences. But the Habsburgs' foes were not limited to France. To the east, the Ottoman Empire, under the formidable Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, surged with unstoppable force. Their armies seized Belgrade and laid siege to Vienna itself, threatening the very heart of the empire. At sea, the Ottoman fleet, commanded by the legendary Hayreddin Barbarossa, clashed fiercely with Spanish and Genoese navies across the Mediterranean. This was no mere territorial dispute. It was a brutal confrontation between Christianity and Islam, a collision of civilizations that would shape the fate of millions. Yet, even as silver and gold poured in from the American colonies, the empire's coffers were never full. Emperor Charles V found himself trapped in a relentless financial struggle. He borrowed endlessly from bankers, mortgaged future revenues, and sold offices and privileges just to keep the war machine running. By the end of his reign, the state's debt had ballooned to astronomical heights, a crushing burden that foreshadowed the empire's fragile future. In 1556, worn down by illness and haunted by failures in quelling Protestantism, Charles abdicated. His decision was seismic. He split his vast domains between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand. Philip inherited Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and the colonies, while Ferdinand took the Austrian lands and the imperial crown. Charles retreated to a monastery in Extremadura, where he died 2 years later, leaving behind a fractured empire and a legacy of impossible choices. Philip II, unlike his father, was a Spaniard through and through, born and raised in Spain, speaking its language, rooted in its soil. His reign from 1556 to 1598 marked the zenith of Spanish power, the empire's golden age. He moved the capital from Toledo to Madrid, transforming a modest city into the beating heart of his realm. Near Madrid, he built the monumental Escorial Palace Monastery, a fortress of stone that mirrored Philip's own stern, methodical, deeply religious nature. Philip was a devout Catholic who saw himself as the defender of the faith. His mission was clear: crush Protestantism and enforce the Counter-Reformation. Within Spain, he cracked down ruthlessly on the Moriscos, Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity. When they rebelled in 1568 in the Alpujarras Mountains, Philip crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency, scattering the Moriscos to break their communal bonds and erase their identity. But the greatest challenge lay beyond Spain's borders, in the Netherlands. In 1566, a revolt erupted, fueled by economic grievances, political neglect, and the imposition of foreign rulers. The rebellion quickly took on a religious dimension as Calvinism spread among the provinces. Philip responded with iron. He sent the Duke of Alba with an army to impose a reign of terror, executing thousands suspected of rebellion or heresy. Yet repression only fanned the flames of resistance. Under the leadership of William of Orange, the rebels waged a fierce guerrilla war backed by Protestant states and England. By 1581, the northern provinces declared independence, forming the Republic of the United Provinces. The southern provinces, what we now call Belgium, remained under Spanish control. This division marked a turning point, a fracture that would echo through centuries. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Queen Elizabeth I ruled England with a sharp eye on Spain's ambitions. England supported the Dutch rebels and sent privateers like Francis Drake to raid Spanish ships and colonies. In 1588, Philip launched a massive naval campaign against England, the infamous Spanish Armada. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would decide the fate of empires. What if a single decision could bring an empire to the brink of collapse? Philip II of Spain possessed the mightiest fleet the world had ever seen, an armada deemed invincible. But this overwhelming power met disaster when English ships annihilated many vessels, and savage storms crushed others off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The consequences were catastrophic, a devastating blow to Spain's prestige and a crippling financial drain that echoed across the nation. Yet the shadows of defeat only deepened the stakes as the empire teetered on the edge of irreversible decline. Amidst this turmoil, Philip's greatest triumph emerged unexpectedly on the seas near Lepanto in 1571. Commanded by Don Juan of Austria, Philip's own illegitimate half-brother, the combined fleets of Spain, Venice, and the Papal States shattered the Ottoman navy. This victory, while failing to halt Ottoman expansion entirely, shattered the myth of Turkish naval invincibility and sent ripples of hope through Christendom. But the battle's symbol of strength disguised the relentless tide of conflict yet to come. In one bold stroke of fate, the death of King Sebastian of Portugal in Morocco opened a dynastic crisis that Philip decisively seized. By 1580, he united the crowns of Spain and Portugal, forging an empire that stretched across continents and oceans, a vast global dominion where the sun was said never to set. This union expanded Spain's reach, folding Portugal's expansive holdings in Brazil, Africa, and Asia under one crown. Yet such vastness was a double-edged sword, sowing seeds of overextension and inevitable fractures beneath the surface. The Americas became the beating heart of this sprawling empire. Following Columbus's fateful voyage, conquistadors like Cortez and Pizarro carved empires from the ruins of mighty indigenous civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, and others, transforming vast territories into Spanish dominions. By the mid-16th century, Spain ruled most of the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, Western South America, and even the distant Philippines. But beneath conquest's glory lay a dark engine of exploitation, a relentless extraction of resources and people that would fuel the empire, yet fuel its moral decay. Silver flowed like rivers from rich mines in Potosi and Zacatecas, injecting unprecedented wealth into Spain's coffers. Over 16,000 tons of silver crossed the Atlantic through Spanish hands during the 16th and 17th centuries, flooding Europe with precious metals. This influx triggered the so-called price revolution, a surge of inflation that distorted economies continent-wide as precious metals outpaced the production of goods. The empire's wealth was both its strength and a harbinger of instability. To govern this labyrinth of colonies, Spain created a complex bureaucracy centered in Madrid, the Council of the Indies. The New World was divided into viceroyalties. New Spain governed Mexico and Central America, while Peru ruled vast stretches of South America. Later, New Granada and other territories followed, each layer adding complexity and tension to imperial control. Yet, beneath the official order lurked chaos, brutal exploitation, rebellion, and impossible choices that tested the limits of imperial power. The Council's efforts culminated in the new laws of 1542, designed to curb the enslavement of indigenous peoples and reform the encomienda system. But lofty decrees rarely translated into reality. Exploitation persisted, unchecked and savage, as colonial greed overwhelmed royal mandates. The human cost of empire grew unbearable, with profound consequences echoing across generations. The Church, wielding spiritual authority, played a pivotal role in this colonial saga. Missionaries, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans poured into the Americas, converting indigenous populations and establishing schools and hospitals. In Paraguay, Jesuit reductions created unique settlements where Native Americans lived shielded from colonial abuses, isolated, yet preserved. These enclaves revealed a fragile hope amid the empire's harsh dominion, a fleeting sanctuary in a world ruled by iron and gold. Economically, the colonies were engines of raw material extraction and cash crops, sugarcane, tobacco, cocoa, and indigo destined for European markets. Manufacturing and crafts remained stunted, as colonies were designed primarily as suppliers of raw goods and consumers of Spanish products. This rigid system forged wealth, but also sowed dependency and stagnation, crippling colonies before they could flourish independently. Yet, beneath this surface, tensions simmered. Unseen forces set the stage for upheaval. The story of Philip II's empire is one of colossal ambition, relentless conquest, and the brutal calculus of power. Every victory and defeat carved a path lined with irreversible choices, human fear, and staggering consequences. The empire's vast shadow stretched across the globe, but the sun's eternal glow concealed a deeper truth. Empires, no matter how mighty, are fragile constructs, ready to crumble under the weight of their own glory. What came next would forever reshape the world's destiny. What if the very identity of a people shifts beneath their feet? What happens when a generation born far from their motherland begins to see itself as something else entirely? In the Spanish colonies, a new culture was taking root, one that diverged sharply from the old world. Creoles, though still speaking Spanish and maintaining many customs, increasingly saw themselves not as Spaniards, but as Americans. This awakening was no accident. It was the seed of rebellion, the spark that would ignite the fight for independence in the 19th century. But this transformation was only the surface of a deeper, more profound upheaval looming on the horizon. Imagine a nation at its zenith, a golden age unmatched in history. Spain, in the 16th and early 17th centuries, wielded immense political and military power. Yet, alongside this force, a cultural renaissance flourished. This was the time of Cervantes and Lope de Vega in literature, El Greco and Velázquez in painting, Victoria and Morel in music. Their works didn't just entertain, they echoed the legacy of the Reconquista, the Moorish influence, and the urgent new ideas of the Renaissance and Counter-Reformation. But how could such brilliance coexist with the looming fractures within the empire? The answers lie in the art, the stage, and the very soul of Spain. Poetry became the pulse of this golden era. Garcilaso de la Vega, a warrior and courtier, imported Italian forms, sonnets, canzones, tercets, breathing new life into Spanish verse. Friar Luis de León wove classical motifs with profound religious fervor, while mystics like St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila penned poetry that reached for divine union. Their words carried the weight of souls searching for meaning in a world of shifting certainties. Yet beneath this spiritual quest lay an undercurrent of tension between faith and doubt, ideal and reality, a tension that would soon grip the nation itself. And then came prose that would alter the literary landscape forever. Miguel de Cervantes gifted the world Don Quixote, a tale not just of a deluded knight, but a profound meditation on the clash between illusion and reason, fantasy and pragmatic truth. Through the misadventures of Don Quixote and his grounded squire Sancho Panza, Cervantes dissected the fragile human psyche and the often painful collision of dreams with stark reality. This was more than satire. It was a mirror, reflecting the contradictions tearing at the heart of Spanish society, and it remains hauntingly resonant even today. The theater exploded onto the cultural stage with unmatched fervor. Lope de Vega, a titan of drama, crafted over 1,000 plays, 400 of which survive, shaping a new form of theater that broke free from classical constraints. His works, brimming with action, passion, and humor, spoke directly to the people, cutting across social strata from nobles to commoners. Following him, Tirso de Molina created the unforgettable Don Juan, while Pedro Calderón de la Barca explored the enigma of freedom and reality in masterpieces like Life is a Dream. Theater became more than entertainment. It was a crucible of national identity, a stage where honor, faith, loyalty to the crown, and martial valor were fiercely performed and contested. But the drama wasn't confined to words alone. In painting, the Golden Age reached breathtaking heights. El Greco, a Greek by birth, fused Byzantine, Italian, and Spanish traditions into a style that distorted form and saturated color to evoke spiritual ecstasy. Diego Velázquez, court painter to Philip IV, mastered portraits of royalty and intimate scenes of everyday life alike. His late masterpieces, Las Meninas, The Spinners, reveal complex compositions, delicate light and shadow, and a psychological depth that would forever transform European art. Yet behind the brushstrokes lay a restless empire, its glory destined to be challenged and undone. Architecture mirrored this evolution, shifting from Gothic and Mudéjar styles toward the Renaissance plateresque, ornate, jewel-like craftsmanship reminiscent of silversmiths. Then came the more austere Herrera style, named after Juan de Herrera, architect of the Escorial. By the 17th century, Baroque swept through Spain's churches, adding emotional intensity to sacred spaces. These shifts embodied a nation searching for order amid chaos, striving to project power and piety, even as the old world began to crumble. Every stone, every arch whispered of choices made, paths taken, and those irrevocably lost. Music, too, flourished, echoing the era's spiritual and artistic grandeur. Tomás Luis de Victoria, one of the greatest Renaissance composers, crafted intricate polyphonic works for sacred ceremonies. Cristobal de Morales and Francisco, names less heard but equally vital, enriched this musical tapestry. Their compositions filled cathedrals with a haunting, sublime sound, a testament to faith and artistic mastery. Yet, as the hymns soared, Spain's empire faced mounting pressures, its future teetering on a razor's edge. The Golden Age was shining, but for how much longer? What happens when faith clashes with power and art with oppression? How do human fears shape irreversible choices that can crumble an empire? Could the glory of a golden age mask the slow decay beneath? These are the harrowing questions haunting 16th and 17th century Spain. In the heart of Counter-Reformation Spain, the Guerrero family forged a polyphonic musical tradition, complex, sacred, and deeply religious. Yet alongside this solemnity, secular music flourished. The vihuelists, masters of the vihuela, Spain's lute, crafted intricate instrumental pieces and accompanied songs that resonated through courts and taverns alike. But beneath this vibrant soundscape lurked a tension between the sacred and the worldly that defined an entire culture on the edge of transformation. Spanish Golden Age culture was a paradox, a fusion of devout religiosity and stark earthly realism. Murillo's Madonnas were not ethereal angels. They were humble peasant girls, flesh and blood. Velázquez's and Zurbarán's Christs bore the raw anatomy of real human bodies, not distant divine figures. Religious poetry blurred lines, using earthly love as a metaphor for divine devotion. This was not mere art. It was a battlefield where spirituality wrestled with humanity's raw essence. Contrast was the soul of this era, the clash between the exalted and the mundane, the ideal and the tangible, the spiritual and the corporeal. Cervantes' Don Quixote and Sancho Panza embodied this duality, as did painters through bodegones and still lifes, everyday objects rendered with near photographic precision. Yet this vibrant culture existed under the iron gaze of the Catholic orthodoxy, where the Inquisition watched relentlessly. The Inquisition was a shadow looming over every brushstroke and written word. Suspected heretics faced brutal persecution. Friar Luis de Leon, a towering intellectual, spent years imprisoned merely for translating the Song of Songs into Castilian. Fear stalked the halls of creativity. Yet, paradoxically, the Inquisition did not halt cultural growth. Many of the Golden Age's brightest minds were clergy themselves, some even serving as inquisitors, caught in a deadly dance of faith and intellect. But Spain's Golden Age was also an epic of unraveling power. Under Philip II, despite the influx of American silver, the empire's finances faltered. Endless wars in the Netherlands, struggles against England and France, drained the treasury. Repeated state bankruptcies shattered creditor confidence and inflated borrowing costs. What began as imperial grandeur edged toward ruin, driven by relentless fiscal strain and political overreach. Philip III, reigning from 1598 to 1621, lacked his father's vigor and skill. He delegated governance to the Duke of Lerma, his favorite, while indulging in pleasures and neglect. The catastrophic expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609 devastated key agricultural regions like Valencia and Aragon. The removal of a significant labor force unleashed economic chaos, deepening Spain's decline. Philip IV, ruling from 1621 to 1665, sought to reclaim lost glory. His chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, launched ambitious reforms and military campaigns, but these efforts only delayed the inevitable. The era closed with the accession of Philip V, grandson of France's Louis XIV, who inherited a fractured empire, losing all European territories outside the Iberian Peninsula. Why did this mighty empire crumble? A web of intertwined causes reveals itself. The once festering economic malaise was perhaps the deadliest. The silver that poured in from the Americas initially enriched Spain, but ultimately fueled rampant inflation. Spanish goods became uncompetitive, strangled by their own wealth. Aristocratic disdain for productive labor flourished. Many aspired to be idle hidalgos, forbidden by their code of honor from trade or craft. Agriculture, the empire's backbone, withered. Vast lands were converted to sheep pastures, controlled by powerful guilds wielding special privileges. In Andalusia and Extremadura, aristocratic families and the church amassed enormous estates, squeezing out peasant farmers. The rural population fled en masse, some to cities, others to colonies, searching desperately for survival. Spain's social fabric was unraveling, thread by thread, as tradition clashed with harsh new realities. Each decision, expelling the Moriscos, bankrolling endless wars, privileging status over productivity, was a step down a slippery slope. Human fear, pride, and rigid ideology combined to seal Spain's fate. The Golden Age shone brightly, but burned out fast, leaving behind a legacy of irreversible choices and haunting consequences. The question remains, could it have been stopped, or was decline inevitable? What happens when an empire's glory becomes its own undoing? How do rigid traditions suffocate innovation? And can a nation survive when its wealth flows from its hands into those of its rivals? Spain in the late 16th and 17th centuries faced these brutal questions, trapped in a relentless spiral of decline. Industrial guilds, once protectors of craft, turned into chains, suffocating progress and innovation. High taxes and roaring inflation forced Spanish goods out of reach in global markets. Meanwhile, trade with the colonies was monopolized by a few cities and companies, funneling America's silver not into Spain's coffers, but into the pockets of Genoese, Dutch, English, and French bankers who supplied the colonies. The crown's treasure slipped away like sand through clenched fingers, but the nightmare was only beginning. Demographics dealt a crippling blow. Ravaging plagues like the Black Death decimated entire regions by 1/3, leaving hollowed towns and abandoned fields. The expulsion of the Moriscos emptied whole districts, while immigration to the colonies, though not massive, drained the workforce still further. Each loss tightened the noose around Spain's fragile economy. Inside the empire's fractured core, political chaos reigned. Spain was never a fully centralized state. Kingdoms within it kept their own laws, institutions, even tariffs. This patchwork made unified economic policy impossible, breeding confusion and paralysis. Bureaucracy ballooned into a labyrinth of councils, committees, and tribunals, duplicating efforts and stalling action. Positions were bought or granted as favors, regardless of merit. Corruption spread from the highest corridors to the lowest clerks, poisoning the system. The legendary Spanish army, once feared across Europe, faltered. The seemingly invincible tercios, masters of battle in the 16th century, had been outmatched by Swedish and French forces by the mid-17th century. The formidable Spanish fleet, once dominating the Mediterranean and Atlantic, suffered crushing defeats at the hands of English and Dutch rivals. Late paychecks sparked mutiny and desertion among exhausted soldiers. Spain's military might was crumbling, and with it, its empire's foundations. But the wounds ran deeper than armies and gold. The cultural rigidity of the Counter-Reformation bred suspicion toward new ideas, clinging fiercely to tradition and religious orthodoxy. As Europe surged forward with scientific revolution, England, France, the Netherlands birthing experimental societies, Spain's universities remained trapped in scholasticism. The empire, once a beacon of power, found itself isolated, missing the very innovations that could have saved it. All these forces intertwined into a vicious cycle. Economic hardship weakened military strength. Military losses cost territories and trade routes, further choking the economy. Cultural isolation blocked the flow of new political and economic ideas, stifling reform. Each failure fed the next, sealing the fate of an empire struggling against the tide of history. Yet despite the shadows, the Spanish Golden Age left an enduring legacy. The Spanish language spread across the Western Hemisphere, becoming one of the world's most spoken tongues. Literature, especially Cervantes' Don Quixote, entered the pantheon of world classics. Painters, from El Greco to Velázquez, shaped European art's future. Architecture, from the grand Escorial to ornate Baroque churches, decorated cities across Spain and Latin America. Spanish music, dance, and cuisine enriched global culture. The imprint of Moorish rule and the Reconquista also pulses through Spain's soul. The Alhambra in Granada, the Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba, the Giralda in Seville draw millions each year, testaments to a complex, intertwined history. Thousands of Spanish words trace back to Arabic roots. Flamenco's fiery rhythms and emotional intensity echo Berber and Arab traditions, a living fusion of cultures that defied centuries of conflict. The story of Spain's decline is not simply one of lost power. It is a tale of fateful decisions, rigid systems, and missed opportunities, where fear of change and the weight of tradition locked an empire in a downward spiral. And yet, from that turbulent era emerged a cultural heritage that continues to shape the world today. What if the very identity of a nation is born not from unity, but from conflict? What if the legacies we inherit are forged in the fires of fear, conquest, and irreversible choices? Spain's story is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a saga of collision, synthesis, and haunting contradictions. The decisions made centuries ago still echo in the soul of a nation, shaping its destiny in ways both visible and hidden. From the golden fields of paella to the sweet richness of Turon, traces of Moorish influence permeate Spanish culture. Yet this culinary heritage is only a fragment of a far deeper, more complex legacy. The Moors, once rulers and then outcasts, left behind a Spain that is neither purely Christian nor entirely Islamic, but a mosaic of intertwined cultures and religions. This fusion, born from centuries of conflict and coexistence, defines the very essence of modern Spain. But how does a nation reconcile with a past marked by violent reconquest and cultural rejection? The Reconquista was not just a military campaign. It was a ruthless purge that sought to erase an entire civilization. The Moors were demonized, their contributions officially denied, yet their influence stubbornly endured beneath the surface. This paradox reveals a brutal truth. Identity is never pure, never untouched by the shadows of the past. Spain is not merely the heir of the Visigoths, nor just the successor of Castile and Aragon. It is the living synthesis of all these layers, conquests, defeats, and cultural exchanges. Empires rise and fall, but cultural heritage persists, stubborn and unyielding. The nation's identity is shaped as much by its losses as by its victories, by its enemies as much as by its champions. This is the paradox at the heart of history itself. Consider the human fear that underpinned these irreversible choices. The fear of the other, the dread of losing power, the desperation to assert dominance. These emotions drove rulers and common folk alike to make decisions that would forever alter the course of history. The scars of these choices remain etched into the fabric of Spanish society, a reminder that every triumph carries a shadow. Today, as the world grapples anew with cultural clashes and questions of identity, Spain's history offers a stark, urgent lesson. Cultures are not isolated fortresses. They are living, breathing entities shaped by exchange and transformation. Attempts to build a pure, untainted identity are doomed to fail because culture demands openness and dialogue, even when that dialogue is fraught with violence and exclusion. Yet this cultural interplay is far from peaceful. It often unfolds amid coercion, oppression, and brutal power struggles. The same events can be remembered as glory or tragedy, depending on who tells the story. This complexity defies simple narratives, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, memory, and perspective. History is never a straight line of progress or decline. It offers no absolute heroes or villains, only human beings caught in the relentless tide of their times. Every era carries its own light and darkness, its triumphs and failures. Spain's dramatic past, with its soaring heights and devastating falls, invites us to embrace this complexity, to see history not as a story of certainty, but as a web of fateful decisions. This is the story of a nation forged in the crucible of cultural collision, a nation that embodies the tension between rejection and acceptance, fear and synthesis. It is a story that challenges us to rethink identity, memory, and the very nature of culture itself. And perhaps, in understanding Spain's past, we can better prepare ourselves for the uncertain challenges that lie ahead. What new stories will emerge from the shadows of history? What lessons remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The past is never truly past. It is a living force, shaping our present and future in ways we have yet to fully grasp.